Hey everybody, you got me, Mr. Benjamin Diggles, the VP of Business Development and co-founder at Constellation Network. Really excited to showcase this presentation today. And with me is my partner in crime, Mr. Jorgensen. You want to say hi?
Hey everybody, hey community. This is really exciting to share this. We've actually been building this in the background for the past couple months, so it's exciting.
Yeah, it is. I mean, we started this year with kind of an inkling and trying to figure out a way to get into the Department of Defense because we knew they had big data issues. And I feel like we've actually been more successful this year with that endeavor than I could have ever imagined. As we dive into this, I do want to do a quick shout out to a community member. Z Dimension had sent these dog tags here, which are really cool, these Dag Chad Constellation dog tags. So I've got these here with the team. I just thought it was very apropos considering the conversation. So big shout out. I thought that was a really cool gesture.
Thank you. That's
yeah,
awesome.
Big thank you. So as we look towards the Department of Defense, I mean, one of the big things that I want to outline before we even dive in, which is why the DoD is actually a little bit more of in a mature state than the private sector. As we spent time with them on base, had a chance to interface with some of the integration capabilities people, the true operators that were handling these issues. They were a much further ahead than those that we've met with in the private sector. And I couldn't wrap my head around it at first until I realized, the private sector, when they're working with data, that's really their IP. That's their gold, if you will. They look at it as very valuable. That's why bulk data collection has become almost commonplace and becoming a regulation nightmare at the same time because there's so much value in data. Whereas the DoD, specifically the Air Force that we were talking to, they look at it in the form of threat vectors, which I'm just going to kind of paint the movie forward as we go through this presentation. That's going to be a lot of the substance we point at, meaning that a lot of this data is cumbersome and a problem. They don't look at it as how do we make money off it, but how do we get it to get out of our way so we can make quicker decisions and be more adaptable in the field and with maintenance costs and so forth. So we're going to go ahead and dive in so you understand what our alignment overview is with the DoD, since I know the community has been really wanting to know what we've been up to. This foundationally shows why this is going to be a really big issue for us. So.
And there genuinely is when you think of like blockchain use cases, we think of like interoperability and things are like that are nice to haves, but they're not needs. And when you start shifting your thinking, and a lot of the private sector is all built on nice to haves. Even interoperability of the automotive sector. We're still not at that need level. We know that we want that technology and we want what it can offer. But when you talk about threat vectors, you actually start to introduce a needs, a must-have. And that's why the Department of Defense, I think, is more mature than the actual private sector as well.
Yeah, that's what we've been seeing, which is great. We're very excited about this. So going into the agenda, we're going to go ahead and do a quick overview. A lot of you already know about Constellation, but of course, this really foundationally sets the tone as to why we are a good fit for the DoD. We're going to go into understanding threat vectors, really anchoring this kind of in the commercial space first, so you can kind of compare and contrast that to the topic of multi-domain command and control, which is the next piece. In the DoD, there is a thing called multi-domain command and control. We're going to go a little bit of what that means and demystify that and zoom out a little bit. And then we're going to zoom in and talk a little bit about the Air Force, the Army, and Navy, and how I know a lot of us in the community and at large looked at Constellation working with the quote-unquote Air Force, but really this is a larger initiative, and we're going to unpack that. And with that, how that kind of rolls back up and creates a secure and agile interoperability play within this large group. We also want to talk quickly a little bit about our Decisive Point Strategic Partnership. This is a group that comes from the military and is a big, meaningful relationship with us in navigating the Department of Defense. And then put a nice cap on it and show the programs of interest beyond kind of the SBIR stuff that we've been doing currently to kind of be our wedge into the DoD, but why we're in alignment with the true DoD strategy from their words, not stuff that we're assuming, but things that we've learned in the last 6 months or so. And then we'll conclude. Sweet. Sorry about the interruption there, folks. We realized that the slides weren't transitioning, so we're just going to go into this motion here. So apologize about that. But picking up where I left off, you know the team here. You know that we have an extended team of not only strong global ambassadors, but community. And then also on the partner side, as I was mentioning, we have some really exciting partnerships that support our strategy within the DoD that we're going to be announcing here in the next month or so. So not sure if there's anything you want to add to this, Ben, before we dive in.
No, I think it's great.
Awesome. And so, Ben, maybe I'd actually have you talk to this because this is, I feel, a vision that really you are responsible for coming up with.
Yeah, I think when we think of Constellation, we think of data validation. And when you think of data validation, you think of that it's more of like the how of what Constellation is. So a lot over around the why. Like, what is it about secure and securing data pipelines and validating rich data sets? What is the bigger vision? And what we kind of came up with is this very powerful statement that what we're actually building is a global network of secured and enriched data to create closed loop experiences and applications. So what that means is if you look at companies in Asia like Tencent, where they have businesses, they've created these businesses that stretch various verticals, both horizontally and vertically, integrating themselves into many aspects of a consumer's life. And in the US, we're kind of met with regulations that don't allow companies to infiltrate, at least on the private sector, infiltrate people's data in a way that, because Asia has been allowed to do this, they've actually created really robust marketing channels. So that if Benjamin was a big gamer and he watched sports and read the finance section of an application, these companies like Tencent are owning the entire cross-channel communication, allowing them to create what we call a closed loop experience. So understanding the customer's life cycle from a data perspective. And one of the major aha moments for Constellation was that what we're really doing is creating a regulatory compliant ecosystem of data that can spread across various channels, where any sort of centralized company it would be prohibited from doing that. We're actually making it available to create an ecosystem that you can purchase data using data. Different data sources, state channels to create enriched data and applications.
Yeah, I love it. I think the only thing I'd add to this is that it's agnostic. You know, I think that you're probably going to hear us talking a lot about big data in the form of autonomous networks or machine learning or IoT. The reason why we just focus on these groups to begin with is because they create a lot of data. There might be use cases that aren't very appropriate for us to focus on at this stage, but this is really an agnostic solution that's free of any kind of industry alignment. We just happen to be focused on certain industries like the DoD. So yeah, diving into the data lifecycle, I think this really, I mean, if I think about all the different slides that we show about what we do, this really grounds it down because, the big interest that we've heard from the Department of Defense, and really it's kind of really the holy grail for anybody who's dealing with a lot of data, is how close to the source can you ensure that the data is clean, it's validated, and that it's provable, And that's not an easy thing to do, because once bad data makes its way into a system, that could cause a lot of problems. And right now, I feel like we're constantly looking at things that cause big problems. But one of the things that Ben has been talking a lot about that I think is really brilliant is that some of these threat vectors that we're going to cover, it's about just throwing something off just slightly that you may not notice, that may not send off the alarms downstream as the data travels into your system. And it's almost like pointing a cruise ship, if you will, just a couple of degrees in one direction that will cause big problems down the road. What are your thoughts, Ben?
No, absolutely. And it's so when you think of the data lifecycle, it isn't just starting in the very beginning. It is starting in the very beginning, but you also see the questions that occur throughout the entire process that make you kind of reconsider what it means to impact data pipelines and the value around this.
And that also comes down to how we integrate. I mean, when you start thinking about, getting our solution into these system workflows of data, getting in there is not an easy task. I mean, this is one of the things that gives, a lot of different data groups sweaty palms, is having to, get new solutions into their existing workflow. And sometimes that causes them to have to learn new languages and so forth, which slows down the ability to develop and explore and find discoveries within data. And that's really where we shine, is us integrating with those existing data management tools, is one of the main reasons that I think that the DoD got really excited about us. And as we were on site with them, going through our stack in detail, or going through their stack, in detail, one of the things we clearly noticed that kind of perked their ears and they got excited, that was a checkbox that quickly got off the table, was, hey, do you work with existing tools like a MongoDB, as an example? And we're like, as a matter of fact, we do. And that gave them a lot of confidence in working with us. But here you can see, as that source data comes online, and us being appended as close to it as possible, that's where the opportunity to inject validation schema through state channels, so that you can organize that data and notarize it as it comes online before it hits your data lake or your data management tools. And what's awesome is that at any given point, that data can be queried, and the origin, or you can know if it's been spoofed or corrupted, or you can have things that will actually take it offline in an automatic fashion. Ben, any thoughts on this one?
Yeah, and I think you said it really just perfectly. And a lot of what we're building mirrors what you find in traditional data management stacks or centralized data management. And so when you think about integrating across different devices, you also have to consider how does it communicate? How does our technology communicate to what business organizations have already built and spent a lot of money investing in? And so when we talk about integrating with data management stacks, we're really kind of mirroring other infrastructures that are currently being used to provide insights around big data initiatives.
Absolutely. And so I feel like some of the stuff we've touched on has been a good refresher for, the folks that have been following this project for a while. For those that are new, you maybe have a better understanding of where we fit in and why the data pipeline is so important, especially in the terms of threat vectors and spoofing and security reasons. So we're going to pivot a little bit into that and talk a little bit about some of those threat vectors. One of the areas that I like to start is really around the connected car. I mean, that, Constellation probably a year and a half ago got very heavily involved in mobility. We're currently in a private working group with Moby, working on developing some standards, and we'll explain some of that here in the next few weeks of what the details of that is. But those standards are really, really important, not just for the sake of making people's lives hard, but rather that everybody globally that's working on these solutions has a standard they can focus on and deploy, ensuring that as data flows through, that it follows a certain regulation schema, if you will, so that it isn't hacked. And one of the main areas that we've been learning about in our discussions is that securing streaming data is not trivial. But what I love about this is, one of the areas that we hounded down a use case with a prospect was around spoof-proofing keyless entry. And while you're working on that, talking to their team, they're like, well, we can actually fix this without blockchain. We could use a myriad of our existing tools to secure and make sure that this is, locked down. And they're absolutely right. But when you think about all the other systems and creating kind of that global identification graph against all of these different systems, it becomes much more meaningful. And the spoof proof of the keyless entry isn't the only area in which a threat vector lives, as you can see from this graphic. Ben, what are your thoughts?
No, you said it perfect.
Awesome. Yeah. And so this next slide is one that I'm really excited about, that Mr. Jorgensen slid across my desk recently. And I think that it actually kind of zooms out a little bit from the car. Sure, if you think about a single car and having, somebody be able to hack your keys, get in and start it and steal it, sure, there's some damage that can be done. But when you zoom out and you start to think about all these different use cases, from smart traffic control to, even those cloud and SaaS solutions that may have security threats, smart street lighting, they're starting to create, lights that are IP enabled. and everything has sensors these days, because that's what makes technology really much better, is as these sensors bring data in, they can react and do new meaningful things in an automated way. And like public transport, I mean, the idea of hacking a bus becomes a very scary thing. So I don't know, Ben, I don't know if you have any thoughts on this. This is a slide that I think is true to your heart. But
yeah,
what do you think about the security?
I worked with Headroom on building this this vision out, and I think it's fascinating to note, and it's kind of one of those aha moments that you think about deploying a node on something like a keyless or a keyless remote, and you think about creating a dedicated state channel around the data that's produced from that keyless remote, to then connecting to other state channels around all other points of vectors, creating a hylomorphism around that data, creating this like wholly regulated system of state channels that then you zoom out even further to smart cities and all the different touch points that you create state channels around. You're actually just continually building out the network and deeper layers of accountability. So I think this becomes a very fascinating thing to go, okay, it's great that we see these cars that can trade data between different devices, but when you think about the macro perspective in terms of threat vectors and spoofing and hacks that can occur that we don't even identify for years at a time, that's the real big vision here that really kind of sets the tone.
Yeah, and I think you said something early on about how this isn't as big of a priority for the private sector, where it is for the DoD. The DoD has a lot of pain trying to get some of these different constituents to coexist or interoperate their data sets. Where right now there's not necessarily a burning need for these buses and for cameras and sensors all to communicate. Sure, there's a ton of possibility, and it's going to make our lives a lot better. But when you think about threat vectors from other countries and warfare, those are the things that tend to keep people up at night, not if the bus is going to communicate with a smart grid properly. And don't get me wrong, those things are very important, and there's a lot of money going into them, especially in major cities like Dubai and Singapore. However, as this stuff matures, I think that Constellation is really well positioned at the foundational level to ensure that as these things mature, that they're in a secure and thriving state. And, of course, we have Spore being our, API data in and data out platform that really is what brings this all together as people build these state channels out that allows that data to be ingested and then queried within real time and interoperated against new data sets. And those new data sets is where things get very interesting. And this is a great representation, kind of a prototype mock of what smart city data pipelines might look like in a dashboard capacity. I think it's important to mention that, Constellation isn't in the business of dashboards, but while working on a lot of these things, pulling this stuff into something that's an enriched dashboard or a mission control center will always tend to be the output, with the ultimate goal of it being automated, so secure that you don't need to manage or monitor the data. It just does what it's supposed to because it's thriving in the right environment. Anything you want to add to this before we move on to the DoD?
No, it's great. Thanks.
Great. And so we're going to talk a little bit about multi-domain command and control within the Air Force, Army, and Navy. And multi-domain command and control is a lot. It's a big mouthful, MDC2. Really, multi-domains. Domains are nothing more than different agencies, data creators. Think of them as companies. Think of them as the one domain may be that smart camera, or a collection of sensors in the city, or it might be the public transportation group. And that the public transportation group has their own rules and rules of engagement with their data and how they work with their different operators and how they incentivize and penalize different groups within their workflow. And that's very isolated and siloed. So it is not a trivial task to get that to interoperate, with IP-enabled traffic lights that might be doing their own thing. And that's really what multi-domain means. These are different domains within the DoD. And command and control basically means the ability to make decisions with that. Think of mission control centers of like, okay, we have all this information coming in and we need to act quickly to make decisions against an adversary or we need to act quickly to mitigate threats that are happening in the supply chain, or minimize costs through loss, through bad data management. I mean, there's a whole myriad of what command and control really means. And this is really predicated on groups called the integrations capabilities teams, the ones that are really focused on bringing this data together. So looking at this slide, the data management problem is really that big data. We know this with the fact that big data makes over 20% of the DoD problem areas, representing the largest pain point in the entire US military. I mean, just let that sink in how big of an issue it is. And tech interoperability is really next in line. I mean, think about these legacy siloed systems, not being able to command and control that across these different constituents, these different data creators. And being able to organize that data gets even hairier. We learned that some of these mission control planning capabilities within the Air Force sometimes take them up to like 3 days, because it's all about confidence. It's not about how quick can we pull data together, because they can get pretty sloppy and just say, oh, this looks good enough, that looks good enough. But that's not good enough. They want to ensure that the confidence of this data is extremely high, so when they make a move, that it's got precision. And if they don't, that can mean a loss of life. It can mean, war crimes. It can mean a whole lot of stuff. And then furthermore, having a queryable database is absolutely crucial. And these are big pain points. The ability to make those fast decisions allows them in the moment to be able to query that data to ensure that it is secure, that it hasn't been spoofed, it hasn't been corrupted. They know the source in which it came from, where it came from, at what time. And they know by smashing it against another data set, they now have something that gives them a leg up against the competition. And so the last thing to ground this one is that we were an SBIR 19.2 phase 1 contract awardee. This means that we've got carte blanche within the DoD moving forward. So we can work with the DoD in a lot of different capacities. The SBIR program operates across 12 different agencies within the DoD. So it's not specific to the Air Force. It also includes the NSA, NASA, Army, Navy, and so forth. As I said, there's 12 of them. And so we were really, really proud to be one of 2 blockchains to ever be selected by the DoD under a contract. Ben, anything you want to add to this one?
Yeah, I think this is a real big strategic vision that you've laid out, Benjamin. And I want to really stress the importance of this is that when you think of data systems communicating, we often think of it in a technological sense. But what we're actually seeing is that, yes, we can get different systems to send data between one another, but what about outside, in between each organization, like Navy and Army and Air Force? Now go out, just like we were zooming in and zooming out of a smart city to zoom in from here's an Air Force use case to how do we take data from the Air Force and communicate with the Army? In fact, we've learned that certain divisions within the DoD actually use the metric system versus working in the American feet and inches. And so we've learned that there's even that level of accountability and interoperability that needs to be done around the data. And so what I'm saying here is that once we make systems communicate, then it also means having operational people to discern what the data is saying. And so our goal is way beyond the Air Force, but actually is interoperability amongst various operational staff that extends beyond the technological component.
Yeah, I appreciate the kind words. It is a big vision, and it is around something much bigger than just trying to get blockchain into the Air Force, or just trying to get things on an immutable ledger. This is really about interoperability at scale, security at scale, and how this data is being created at a crazy rate, and the need to secure it as it's being created.
Because there are threat vectors, right? There are threat vectors that occur if great, a system can communicate, but if the person on the other side that has to make a mission critical decision can't discern what the data is saying, now we've hit another bottleneck. So our vision, while we thought it was purely about systems talking and communicating, it actually has operational impact.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, here's a great quote from the baseline requirements for government and military encryption algorithms is that centralized systems are too expensive and not fast enough to process, validate, and manage the volumes of data required for making quick decisions in the field without significant security risks. I mean, it's almost like they wrote it for Constellation. And this is a 2019 quote showing that this is a growing issue. And right now, there's so much investment in centralized systems, and they are siloed. So now it's like this new wave of investment on how do we break those silos down so that they can communicate with one another. You know, the one thing to kind of point out here is you have these collectors and producers, again, satellites, ground troops, you know, fleets, supply chain. All of this stuff is really important when it comes to the DoD, and bringing that up in a meaningful way, even if it was incremental, even if Constellation was to be able to impact this by 0.5%, that's super meaningful. But I actually truly believe, and this is why I believe they've selected us to work with them, we're going to make leaps and bounds through this new open network approach. Diving into a little facts about what we've learned about the Air Force is that the Air Force is creating 1,820 terabytes of data every 60 seconds. I mean, massive data collection. And in fact, I was talking with one of their folks. This stat came out probably about 8 months ago, and he was like, "Oh, I'm positive it's beyond that now," which only makes sense. And we've also learned that over 80% of the time is from Gartner. This has been validated by the the private space, that this time's been used for from data scientists to clean it before it can be used, which makes sense. It goes back to that concept of confidence when using this. And we know from the chief data officer of the Air Force that the compounding issues include limited metadata, multiple formats, lack of standards, incomplete poor data quality, manually intensive integrations, cumbersome process to access, interfaces not interoperable. This isn't unique just to the DoD. I mean, every major company that's struggling with data is dealing with this. I think that this group is just being very forthcoming that, hey, we have these issues, where others might be a little bit more shy to share that. So I do want to say that these use cases over to the right that you see on your screen are those that we extracted specifically from the lips of integration capabilities folks within the Air Force. And you'll see that they align perfectly with what distributed ledger has to offer. And I do believe there's a lot of really great solutions out there that could work with the DoD in some capacity. However, I don't think that they're actually ready for those big data scalable kind of regulations. And that's where Constellation really shines, is that we're capable of handling this stuff in scale. You know, I'm only going to touch on a few of these, one being transmit classified information over an unclassified information network securely. Can they do this today? Yes. There's certain ways they can do it, but can they do it using an open network? That's what they're interested in looking at, because they see that there's exponentially more security and more they can do with that if they're able to use it in a new way. And preventing spoofing corruption of incoming data streams for mission execution and planning, that's really our sweet spot. I mean, at the end of the day, folks, if we're able to nail that one use case right there, it's applicable about to anybody who's creating data, because all of this data has the propensity over the air, using a myriad of methods that we talked about, from the connected car and the connected city, to spoof that data. And that can cause big problems downstream. And I'm actually just going to touch on the last one there, which is secure streaming data as close to the source as possible. I mean, that's always going to be something that's important to us. That's why we talk about light nodes that we're going to be bringing on board, around Q2 or Q3 of next year, a major feature that we're really excited about, so that these things can run, nodes can run on low power, being able to collect data on things such as sensors. Anything you want to add to this, Ben?
No, it's a great slide, and really grounded us at Constellation and kind of understanding how data is traded between organizations. And somebody even like the U.S. Air Force, they have so many third-party vendors that they're sending data to, that there has to be a way to account for sending that data, and maybe even sometimes monetizing that data. So how can DAG and an open network be used to sell or trade data with those third-party vendors in a secure way?
Yeah, and looking at like some of the big investments, I don't know if anybody's heard about the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter being a $1 billion aircraft, the most, I guess, technologically advanced piece of equipment, I think, in American history that we know about. I'm sure there's a lot of secret ops stuff that will blow our minds. That said, this is quite the machine. I mean, it has a zillion sensors on it. And really, it's nothing more than just one big major supercomputer. And they are using a lot of the existing data management stuff that we discussed earlier in the presentation, such as MongoDB and Databricks. I mean, these things are core to the ability of handling this thing. It creates, what's it say on here? Something like 8 million lines of complex code exist in this system. The point being is that when you're looking at stuff that has this level of intricacies, it requires the ability to secure some of those threat vectors. They have a thing called a threat library that lives on board that has a list of all the threats that they've been able to procure from the past. And as the radar warning receiver brings on incoming threats, within real time, it is matching those new threats compared to an existing library. Again, I don't think that the future of warfare really exists with the guns and the missiles within this jet, but rather the data that's flowing in and out of it that could actually cause the steering of those guns and missiles to go in a direction that could be, I guess, detrimental, if you will. Anything to add here?
No.
And then with the U.S. Army, I mean, U.S. Army, we've worked with them on a couple of exploring a couple of different proposals and different use cases, and they're cut from a different cloth. And you know, the U.S. Air Force has a ton to deal with when it comes to mission control planning, bringing a lot of data. They really are kind of the data folks when it comes to the DoD, but the U.S. Army creates a ton of that data. And really their big focus is how do we secure and make sure that the level of confidence of safety of the connected soldier is as high as possible. And these soldiers are being retrofitted with more and more sensors every single day. I mean, the amount of money and precision that they're putting in, much like the F-35, it matters. I mean, we're talking loss of life here. And if it's because of faulty helmet sensors that are steering them the wrong direction, that could be detrimental. And so clean and secure streaming data increases confidence to give an informational advantage, which will ultimately result in saving human lives. And so this is a big issue when you think about this being a single domain. Again, you have all these ground troops out there that are creating stuff where this is crucial data coming off of things like battle rifle sensors that needs to feed up to these larger groups to ensure the safety of the lives of their troops. Anything to add, Ben?
No, it's great.
Sweet. Yeah, and then the U.S. Navy kind of bringing a third domain into it as well. A lot of folks don't know that the U.S. Navy is the world's biggest supply chain outfit, and 73% of the Navy supply chain technology spending over the last 4 years was on sustainment and day-to-day operations, meaning that almost 75% of the billions and billions, I mean, it's so much money is going to just the status quo. That shows you how big of an issue this is. For them to be going after new ways to approach this, 25% of the budget needs to go up drastically, or that budget needs to shrink because their efficiencies from an operational standpoint are going off. I mean, going up. I mean, the life cycle costs of dealing with supply chain management is a big issue, and it is seen as a real security threat when it comes to war. Because if you're able to throw off, an adversary's supplies or get involved in the way that they're transferring a lot of their means, you can really cause a lot of problems. And so, it's very obvious. I put over here in the supply chain risk management section that software and databases embedded with bad data make it difficult to track parts. I mean, this is all stuff based off of a big Navy data and analytics report that just came out this year. Not profound that to making these AI systems smarter, they need to ensure that the data that's coming in isn't incomplete or missing, because it affects them, into the trillions of dollars annually. And so, but again, their number one focus is on human lives. That's one thing I do love about the DoD is that they're not focused on making money. They're focused on being more secure, better to handle the adversaries, and decreasing costs and threats to human lives. Anything to add on the supply chain management side, Ben?
Yeah, I think supply chain is like the most common use case for modern blockchain technology. And when we think about supply chain, we think about like tracking a product or a device or something across many different stakeholders, and revealing ledger balances of at each stage in the process of getting a product from A to B. What we've started to paint here is that this is just one aspect of what Constellation and securing data pipelines can do.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I mean, as you kind of zoom it back out, starting off with multi-domain command and control being a big umbrella, and then for us to kind of go down all the way to the sensors that may be woven into a soldier's fabric of his clothing or her clothing, how important even that one sensor, and you kind of scale it out, you start to see how, yes, okay, they're creating 2,000 terabytes of data every 60 seconds within the Air Force alone. I mean, this becomes a big problem. And that's why, yes, we're early. And I can't state that enough. I think that the community has been really excited about the adoption of Constellation within the Air Force and other outfits, and it's going to continue. We're going to continue to permeate those, but know that we're working to stitch a big vision. We're not just going after quick contracts to prove out that, hey, we've got customers, but rather we want to solve big issues that compound over time. And you look over, going back to kind of our data pipeline, as well as the original multi-domain command and control slide of the threat vectors, you have those big data collectors and producers like the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force there off to the left. And then you have all these different domains, these institutions, the NSA, NASA, doesn't matter if it's the Air Force. They all need to be not only able to communicate with each other, but also be able to ingest direct data from those creators as well. Because those centralized systems, going back to what we were talking to a few slides back, they're just not going to cut it. There has to be a way to be able to pivot much quicker and creating a secure and agile interoperability environment. So that as it goes downstream, those big data consumers, whether it's applications, business intelligence tools, and so forth, the two biggest important ones, I think, really are artificial intelligence systems as well as mission control systems. That's where the magic really happens. So this kind of zooms it back out and talks a little bit about why this bigger picture from my multi-domain command and control really matters.
Yeah, it's so interesting to ground this idea of the Army talking to the Navy, but it shouldn't really surprise any of us that the Army needs to talk to the Navy on an operation or just day to day, where logistics. And so you take this and you can almost mirror what communities do in blockchain. So kind of taking this into another sector is actually looking at different blockchain companies and how our community has really pushed us to work with various groups like Chainlink and IOTA and Quant. And you have a similar thing that makes sense to people. Is how does one blockchain company connect to another one, which helps everybody kind of have like a little grounding in how this whole blockchain world works. And we're seeing the same thing mirror into the DoD.
Yeah, totally agree. It's definitely a foundational play, and that's why it's important to think in a foundational mindset. And some of those companies you talked about, truly the integrations and the partnerships that you've been spearheading with some of these great ecosystem partners, Ben, are going to play a big role down the line. But it all starts around that foundational vision. Speaking of vision, one partnership that we're really proud of. This was one that we invoked fairly quickly after we won our contract, was with a group called Decisive Point. At the end of the day, let's be honest here, Ben and I and the team, we're not DoD folks. We don't have military backgrounds. And in fact, that's a big plus side. You would think that the DoD would kind of scoff at those that don't have that military background, but they've realized that those are the groups that are actually doing the really interesting stuff. And historically, it's been really hard to get these groups to work with the DoD. So they created platforms like AFWorks and the SBIR program, things that we work through to be able to take us kind of private companies and find that true transition phase path into working with the DoD and different outfits. But we knew that once it came to the contracting process, getting in the room with some of these folks and learning how to have the right decorum, if you will, how to talk to them, we needed a handler, if you will. And so that's why Decisive Point was a partnership that we really didn't have to hesitate at all when it came down to it. And furthermore, their leadership team, Tommy and Eric, they also have a gentleman by the name of Steven and another one of Brandon. I mean, they're just great guys to work with, very reactive. And they've been holding our hand through everything to ensure that, hey, we're making the right steps forward. That said, they're not an outreach shop. So these guys aren't lining up deals for us, but rather they're helping us once we snag those deals and how to really talk to these folks. But they've been instrumental in pointing us to agencies and different domains, if you will, that could utilize our solution that otherwise we wouldn't have any idea about. So big props to these guys. They're ex-military folks, both of them, as you can see from their bullets over here, which I'm not going to read off. Extremely well-poised folks for what they're up against. So anything to mention on this partnership, Mr. Jorgensen?
Yeah, they're great. Great team to work with. It's like getting like 100+ years of combined experience in the military bestowed upon us, and it's a very different space and industry. And I got to say that we've all had a lot of fun working with them.
Yeah, they're awesome. Type of guys that'll send you something at 2 a.m. on a Sunday that's like, hey, you need to do this. This is awesome. So yeah, big ups to Decisive Point. Big props to those guys. And I was actually really surprised. Going back to the DoD, understanding these solutions. As I got on the phone with one of these contacts at the Air Force, that it was actually an intro from Decisive Point. He was like, "So what do you guys do?" And I told him, "Well, yeah, well, we're a blockchain solution." "Well, tell me a little bit more about it." And so I told him what a directed acyclic graph was, and he knew what it was. He's like, "Oh, I know what a DAG is." And I know that may not seem like a big deal, but when you talk to a lot of folks in the private space, you have to unpack this a little bit more. Whereas this team, they just really get the technology and the value proposition, which is really great. And one of the big outcomes recently that we're extremely proud of, I mean, personally for me, Benjamin Diggles, this is one of the things that in my career, I would say is in my top 3 highlights. So it really is a big deal. We have a letter of support directly from a group called Air Mobility Command, our Air Operations Center. Again, this is the group out on Scott Air Force Base in Illinois that is responsible for corralling all the mobility data of all the operators in the world and putting it in a mission control type format. So going to multi-domain and command and control, we really landed in the belly of the beast. This is who we went and visited with. We've got strong relationships with these folks, and they were kind enough in a short amount of time to put down on paper their intentions of scaling their working relationship with us. So this is a big deal for us. This is confirmation that you just don't see in the blockchain space. It's one thing for us to fill out a proposal and get in the door. It's another thing to really build relationships with folks that are on the ground level doing this stuff. They get it, they endorse it, and they want to scale with us. So anything you want to say to this, Ben?
Yeah, I mean, I want to give you props for this. This was a huge shift in the kind of mainstream adoption of blockchain and the overall sentiment coming from this organization that this isn't simply just a research. The intention of the United States Air Force to write this letter is so that we can walk into other branches of the military with extra confidence that this has been validated. Our technology has been validated. It has been looked over. There's a stamp of approval so that we can move other conversations in the military and DoD a lot faster. So this letter of support is, we really kind of append it to any email when we introduce ourselves as kind of like a badge of, hey, we're real. We've had people vet this. This meets their needs statement. So going back to the very beginning and talking about like actually needing this technology, intention to work with us, and that you should give it you should be working with us as well. I mean, it's essentially what this is. It's a very, it's not easy to get. And as Benjamin said, he's done a great job of driving those relationships to build that trust and foster the next phase of working with the DoD.
Heck yeah, it's our Boy Scout badge of honor, our first badge, folks. We got many more to come here. Speaking of many more to come, there are, just to kind of put a capstone on this presentation, there are a ton of big data initiatives within the DoD. Again, 20% of their pain point, biggest category, is data management issues. And so these are all different groups that we're leaning into. We're a small team, so we have to be kind of choosy who we decide to go into an engagement with, because we can't do everything. But we're, again, seeing an amazing reception from these groups, that they get it and they see the value of what we have to bring to the table. That said, it is working with the Department of Defense. So my one ask for the community is, like, give us time, because this stuff, it does take time. They're not here to just shoot from the hip. Like, they want to understand it at a deep level, but they have, to Ben's point, this isn't research. This isn't, oh, go do some papers and let us know what your findings are and we'll do some peer review. No, this is all about true adoption to inflict like transformation within these different units, these different domains. I went over there onto the right, and I'm not going to read all this, but defending network systems and data, this is right out of their data strategy book that we've received. Everything in yellow is stuff that we can directly affect, while there are others on here that I kind of left off that I know we can kind of tertiary have an impact on, and being in those ecosystems. But these are things that, by adding Constellation to their workflow, they're going to see a direct influence and impact to kind of their data needs. So anything you want to say before we move to a conclusion, Mr. Jorgensen?
That's great.
So yeah, that is the presentation. I mean, again, the goal here, folks, was to get you educated, understand not only what are we up to, what we've done so far, but what we're aiming to do. And keep in mind, this is multi-domain command and control. This is a big vision that is no different than some of the stuff you're going to see come out of Ben's upcoming research papers and the things that he's going to be bringing to the table around that foundational piece that really allows things like connected cities to truly thrive, without allowing those spoofing or threat vectors to come in and bring the whole thing down. Because we do want autonomous machines and autonomous networks to be able to coexist without the threat of something sneaking in and causing a catastrophe, really. So we're going to continue to keep pushing hard on this stuff. We have some more announcements about the Department of Defense that's going to be happening around first quarter of next year that I think is really going to slingshot us. But keep in mind that 2020 is going to be a big year of growth for us. And I think by us securing that letter of support as a badge of honor as we go through navigating these different institutions and constituents is going to play a big role. Why don't you go ahead and take us home, Ben?
Yeah, Diggles, this is a fantastic presentation. I can't thank you enough for the work and that you put into this, and the strategic vision. It's beautiful. It's an amazing narrative, and it goes from getting the contract all the way to learning to navigate the DoD with decisive point, understanding the impact of our technology and future proofing against major threat vectors, all the way to getting a letter of support by the main division that handles mobility data within the Air Force. So we've got more to go, and we're just getting started. So great
Heck
job.
Yeah.
Man.
All right, folks, let us know if you have any questions. That said, if you're in the community and people have questions about the Department of Defense, Air Force, where we're at, we would really appreciate your help in disseminating this video to those folks to keep them educated. But if there's anything that I wasn't able to answer in here that I can answer, without getting in trouble, I'd be more than happy to answer your questions. Otherwise, well, you'll hear from us soon. Thank you so much.
Thanks.